We're set up here for work in progress. I'm going to be playing later on today for that event that's after. That's why this is, I know some of you thought I was going to be playing the keyboard today and rocking out, but no. Well, I don't know if you've ever had to preach on the Ten Commandments, but it is a daunting task, and really we should take 5 or 6 weeks and look at the Ten Commandments. As one friend of mine used to say, how about taking one and taking 10 years to work on it? Just one. 10 years. Let it sink in. We have a lot of problems with the Ten Commandments. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that before, but we do. They can be used as a weapon or a tool. They can be helpful or not helpful. We've got the Ten Commandments there, and many of us had to memorize them as little kids. And I just realized yesterday, somehow memorizing, the message I got in church school was, if you memorize something from the Bible, you were a good Christian. I cannot figure out what memorizing something has to do with being a good Christian. And we know lots of Christians who've got whole passages of the Bible memorized. They're keen to tell you about it. I don't know if that makes them good Christians, to tell you the truth. But that was the message we got as kids on the little yellow Bible Society cards. If you got the Apostles' Creed and you learned the Lord's Prayer and you memorized the Ten Commandments, you're a good Christian. So those of us who didn't memorize them or have forgotten what all the Ten Commandments were, and I was testing Reverend Deb last night. I'm not going to tell you how she scored. She got the good ones. Those of us who have forgotten them think we might be not faithful people, which is hooey, if you ask me. So some of our trouble with the Ten Commandments came from how they were used in the church as a memorization tool, not for their true purpose, really, or the judging tone that they have. Thou shalt not. You know, remember that voice? I was daring Dale Halliday to speak in that godly voice, like on the mountain. Remember in Ten Commandments, the fiery flame finger came and it did that bad Hebrew? That was bad looking Hebrew. Well, actually, it went this way. Right? Right to left. Like Charlton Heston never knew Hebrew. What other stumbling blocks do we have about the Ten Commandments? Well, that most of us aren't keeping them. That's tough. So we approach them with that kind of memorization godliness, but then really aren't actually following through on most of them. And so that's a trouble. So we don't even want to read them or remember that we remembered them. That's a stumbling block. Or we use them to judge others. Peter Short, who was moderator of the United Church of Canada many years ago, was sitting right here in our sanctuary one night, and he told the great story of a man who took the time to write a letter. It was an angry letter to the moderator about stuff that was going on in the United Church of Canada and decisions that had been made. And Peter had the practice of phoning every single person who wrote an upsetting letter to him. So he wouldn't write back to them. He'd phone them. And he phoned this man, and it kind of surprised the man. You know, you get a call from the moderator of the United Church. And as he got talking to the man, he said, well, are you, what church community do you belong to? I don't get to church very much. But I follow the commandments. And truthfully, there's 613 commandments in the Old Testament. So, Peter said, oh, well, which one? Which commandments? And then, the man was in all flushed. He says, well, was there 10? Oh, well, tell me about them. Couldn't list them. And Peter was just truthfully trying to engage the conversation, but the man couldn't lift up any of them. But that's the kind of way we use them as a tool to protect ourselves. I follow the commandments. I follow the Ten Commandments. I don't know anybody who's ever said that actually is following all 10 of the Ten Commandments. So they have this sticky place for us in our world, in our faith life. We've seen them as absolutes. Some of them we just don't understand. Some of them are truthfully hard to follow, like honoring your mother and your father. I've bumped into lots of people in my life who should not honor their mother and father because of the things they did to them as children. So I've known a lot of people who suffered through continuing to have a relationship with parents who should have been dumped years before, out of just healthiness and good boundaries. But I would say the purpose of that commandment, just in case you're shocked by that, is to honor, as Summer said, I think, honor your elders. I think we always should have a set of elders that we do honor with all of our hearts, because it's good for us and it helps the community go round, helps the community stay strong. So if not your parents, the ones you were given, choose some others. It's important to honor those who are older than us, who are going on before us and have laid the path for us. I think that is extremely important, and that's what's at the root of that commandment for us. Here's the clincher. And I was a little worried about why we were reading from chapter 19 and then skipping to chapter 20 to read the Ten Commandments. But in chapter 19, God starts the prelude to the commandments by saying to Moses, could you please remind the people, I am their God, and I brought them like on an eagle's wings. I lifted them up like as if on eagle's wings, and I brought them to myself. That's the escape from Egypt. God says, I lifted them up on eagle's wings. That's the first time and one of the few times eagle's wings is used as an image. And it's the only time God says, I lifted them up like on my eagle's wings, swiftly. Thanks to the choir for singing that as an introit. Brilliant introit picking. I will raise you up on eagle's wings. God says, I lifted them up like as on eagle's wings and brought them swiftly to myself. So passionate is that language. I brought them to myself. That's God's salvation, God's action in our lives. And that is how we should see the Ten Commandments. We could see them as judgment, and sure enough, there's one that says, love me only because I am a jealous God. And we're hard to know what to do with that. Is God a jealous God or not? I think in the wilderness, surrounded by other gods, I understand why that speech was made that way. But God has this passionate desire to bring us to God's self, swiftly and lovingly to safety. What if we saw the Ten Commandments that way? What if we saw them as rules for our life from a God who is yearning to bring us to God swiftly, to the heart of the matter? Jesus said, I have come not to replace the law, but so that it might be imprinted and engraved on your hearts. And here's our problem with the Ten Commandments. They've usually stayed up here in the old gray matter. When we memorize them and spit them back so that our teachers will be happy or so that we can judge others with them, we have left them up here in the brain and have forgotten to allow them to seep deeply into our hearts, allow them to be imprinted in our lives. We have forgot to wonder, how is it these things that God asks of us will bring us swiftly into relationship with our God, swiftly as if on eagle's wings? And as I mentioned to the kids, they are important because they are both about loving God and about good community. You shall have no other gods before me. That's loving God. You shall not make for yourself an idol. Not many of us are tempted by that, actually carving. But if you love the house you live in too much, or you love your car too much, or you cling to your job as your only sense of identity, guess what? Idols. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Oh, we forgot that one when we were talking to the kids. I read another version of that from the Message. Don't use God's name when you swear or use idle banter. You know, just don't toss God's name around left and right. That's why the Jewish people do not speak the name of Yahweh or write it. Then it starts to turn towards community. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Sundays, well, it was Saturday. It is Saturday. We actually weren't ever asked as Christians to keep a Sabbath, but in the transition from being solely Jewish people into being this new community called Christians, we added a day, Sunday, as the Lord's Day. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Take one day a week, rest, do stuff that you don't normally do, put down the stuff you normally do. Rest and keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. Now we're into community building. Don't murder. That's handy for community. Nothing breaks up community like murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie. I flipped the page for the last one. It's not there. Don't covet what your neighbor has. Don't love and be jealous of others. That's loving God at the beginning, and then loving your community and loving others and how to live together. The table is the same sort of opportunity. The table is an opportunity for God's love and God's ways to seep into our hearts. And we have a lot of hang-ups about the table, just like the Ten Commandments. There are a lot of mental blocks we have about the table. Maybe we should frown and look very serious when we come to the table. Maybe we should dress a certain way. The ministers put on their gowns. It must be serious. It's serious, but not necessarily somber. We have these hang-ups about the table. Are we worthy to come or not? There is a time in the United Church of Canada's history where elders went out, members of the session went out and handed communion chits to people in the weeks leading up to a communion service. They'd have a visit and then decide, I think these people could come to the table. And they'd give them chits. Did any of you involved in that kind of practice? Were you ever an elder who handed out a communion chit? No? Do you remember elders coming to your house? Hands up. Any ever have elders come to your house? Did they give you communion chits, or did it happen on the prairies? Yeah? Wow, if that's hang-ups about the table, I don't know what is, if that isn't. About who gets to come and who doesn't. About barring it to some. Remember when children weren't allowed to come to the table until they were confirmed? That used to burn me inside. Hang-ups. What about Margaret? She what? They came and they gave your mother and your dad a communion chit. Luckily, Margaret's got a free pass to the table. So just like the commandments, we kind of get a little testy about the table. And as all my years here, and it's been over 12, I've tried and hopefully worked with you to open the table in your hearts, to give you a place to come, the great table of invitation, we say, to come and relearn and rework and renew your relationship with God, to allow God's ways to sink into our hearts and have them imprinted on our hearts. It's interesting, there's that kind of flip from no graven images in the Ten Commandments to Jesus saying engrave them, imprint them, these laws, these ways on your heart. That's the true purpose of engraving and printing and carving. It's to get God into your heart swiftly, bringing ourselves to God, God bringing us to God's self through the table. Today I hope for us that we will reread the Ten Commandments. I mean, just the words Ten Commandments give me a, shiver in my spine. Makes me not want to go there. And that language of thou shalt not. But try and find different versions. Try and hear a different voice. Maybe God's saying, don't do this. Could you just not do this? Maybe that helps us approach it better than the Charlton Heston, thou shalt not do this. Try a different language. Try and come toward even one of those commandments. Don't judge yourself too harshly, because that'll put up a block. But open your heart. Maybe we could find one that we need to work on. Maybe it's jealousy. Maybe it's swearing. Maybe it's, the Sabbath the Lord's Day Sunday doesn't look any different in your house than every other day. Maybe you could just decide Sunday's going to look different than Friday for a few months. Just see what that's like. Try and approach it in new ways that allow God to get close to you instead of these were meant for God to be far away from us. And today, as we come to the table, open yourselves again to what might be new about God's ways. About that God, that one God who loves us so much that God asks things of us that are hard but important. Like coming and celebrating with thanksgiving a table of love.